The dust swirled around Grace Zimmerman's worn boots as she stepped off the stagecoach in Keeler, California, her hands trembling not from fear, but from barely contained fury at the telegram crumpled in her dress pocket. The year was 1879, and the small mining town nestled near Owens Lake shimmered in the afternoon heat, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the whims of silver strikes and dried-up claims. Grace had traveled 3 weeks from St. Louis after her father's death, only to discover that the ranch he'd left her was now managed by a foreman who had very different ideas about women and property rights. She adjusted the black mourning dress that clung to her slim frame, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun that did nothing to soften the determined set of her jaw. At 22 years old, Grace had nursed her ailing father through his final months, listening to his stories about the California ranch he'd built from nothing, the cattle that roamed the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, and the dreams he had for their family legacy. What he hadn't told her was that he'd hired a foreman named Dutch Keller 3 years ago, a man who now seemed to think he owned the place. The general store owner, a weathered man with kind eyes, pointed her toward the livery stable where she could rent a horse for the 10-mile ride to the ranch. Grace thanked him and made her way down the dusty Main Street, past saloons and supply shops, aware of the curious stares following her. Women were scarce in Keeler, and a well-dressed woman traveling alone was cause for gossip. At the livery, a young, stable hand looked her up and down skeptically. "You sure you can handle a horse, miss? That ranch is a fair distance, and the trail gets rough past Miller's Creek." Grace fixed him with a steady gaze. "I've been riding since I was 5 years old. I'll manage just fine." The boy shrugged and saddled a sturdy mare, taking her coins without further comment. Grace mounted with practiced ease, ignoring the restriction of her skirts, and set off toward the mountains that rose in purple ridges against the eastern sky. The landscape was unlike anything in Missouri, all sagebrush and scrub, with the glittering expanse of Owens Lake stretching to her left and the peaks of the Sierra Nevada dominating the western horizon. The ranch appeared just as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the valley. Grace's heart squeezed at the sight of the weathered buildings, the corrals filled with cattle, the house her father had described in such loving detail. This was her inheritance, her future, and she would be damned if anyone would take it from her. She dismounted in front of the main house and tied her mare to the hitching post. Before she could knock, the door swung open, and a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard stepped onto the porch. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over her with undisguised disdain. "Miss Zimmerman, I presume," he said, his voice carrying the flat tones of someone from the Eastern Territories. "I'm Dutch Keller, foreman of this ranch. I received word of your father's passing. My condolences." Grace heard no sympathy in his words. "Thank you, Mr. Keller. I've come to take possession of my property." Dutch's expression hardened. "Property that needs managing, Miss Zimmerman. Your father was a fine rancher, but he's gone now, and this operation requires a man's hand. I've been running things smoothly for 3 years, and I intend to continue doing so." "Under my direction," Grace said firmly. "This ranch belongs to me now, and while I appreciate your service, I will be making the decisions going forward." Dutch's jaw tightened, and for a moment Grace saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. Then he forced a tight smile. "Of course, Miss Zimmerman, but perhaps you should observe how we operate before making any changes. Ranch work isn't something a woman can understand in a day or two." Grace bit back a sharp retort, recognizing that she needed to choose her battles carefully. "Very well. Show me around tomorrow morning. For now, I'd like to settle into my father's house." Dutch hesitated, then stepped aside. The house has been closed up since your father's passing. I'll have one of the men bring in your trunk when it arrives on the next stage." Grace stepped inside, her throat tightening at the familiar scent of pipe tobacco and leather that still lingered in the air. The interior was dusty but well-maintained, with sturdy furniture and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Her father's presence seemed to fill every corner, and she had to swallow hard against the grief that threatened to overwhelm her. That night, she lay in her father's bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. Cattle lowed in the distance, and somewhere a door creaked in the wind. She thought about Dutch Keller's barely concealed hostility and wondered what she would face in the days ahead. Her father had taught her about cattle and horses, about reading the land and weather, but running a ranch in hostile territory was another matter entirely. Morning came with roosters crowing and the sound of men's voices outside her window. Grace dressed quickly in a simple calico dress more suited to work than morning and braided her hair in a practical plait down her back. She made coffee in the kitchen, grateful that her father had left supplies, and was drinking her second cup when Dutch knocked on the door. "Ready for that tour, Miss Zimmerman?" His tone was polite but edged with condescension. Grace followed him outside where 6 ranch hands stood near the barn, watching with open curiosity. Dutch made perfunctory introductions, and Grace noted the mixture of respect and uncertainty in their eyes. These were hard-working men who'd known her father, but they clearly had no idea what to make of a woman owner. Dutch led her through the barns and corrals, explaining the daily routines with the air of someone instructing a child. Grace listened carefully, asking pointed questions that clearly surprised him. She'd grown up around horses and cattle, and while her father's ranch in Missouri had been smaller, the principles were the same. "We've got about 300 head right now," Dutch was saying as they walked toward the eastern pasture. "Market price is good, and I'm planning to drive half of them to the railhead in Independence next month." "What about breeding stock?" Grace asked. "My father wrote that he wanted to build up a quality herd, not just sell off our assets." Dutch's expression soured. "Quality breeding takes time and money. Better to take advantage of current prices." "Better for whom?" Grace countered. "Quick profits now mean nothing if we weaken our future stock." Dutch stopped walking and turned to face her, his patience clearly fraying. "Miss Zimmerman, with all due respect, you've been here less than a day. You don't know the market conditions, the costs we're facing, or the realities of running this operation. Your father trusted my judgment, and I suggest you do the same." Grace held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "My father trusted you to manage the ranch under his ownership, Mr. Keller, not to make unilateral decisions about its future. I will review the books tonight, and we can discuss the cattle drive tomorrow." Dutch's face reddened. "She doesn't know her place," he barked, his voice carrying across the yard and causing several ranch hands to look up from their work. "This is no occupation for a woman. You should sell to someone who knows what they're doing and return to wherever you came from." Grace felt her temper flare, but before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Seems to me her place is wherever she decides it to be, especially on her own land." Both Grace and Dutch turned toward the speaker. A man stood near the barn, tall and powerfully built, with shoulders that strained against his worn flannel shirt. His dark hair fell past his collar, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his strong jaw. But it was his eyes that caught Grace's attention, steel gray and direct, holding an intensity that made her breath catch. Dutch's expression shifted from anger to wariness. "Silas, this doesn't concern you. I thought you were up in the high pasture checking fences." The man, Silas, moved closer with an easy, confident stride that reminded Grace of a mountain lion she'd once seen. Came down for supplies and heard shouting. Seems like I arrived at an interesting time. His gaze moved to Grace, and something softened in those hard eyes. You must be Jack's daughter. He talked about you plenty. Said you had more spine than most men he'd known. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at this validation from someone who'd known her father. You worked with my father, Silas nodded. For about 2 years. I'm Silas Everett. I run trap lines in the high country during winter and help with the cattle in summer. Your father was a good man. I'm sorry for your loss. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Grace found herself blinking back unexpected tears. Thank you. That means a great deal. Dutch interrupted, his voice sharp. Silas works contract, Miss Zimmerman, not as a regular hand. He's not involved in the daily operations. Maybe I should be, Silas said quietly, his eyes still on Grace. If there's going to be trouble, Dutch's face darkened further. There won't be any trouble as long as everyone remembers their place. Miss Zimmerman is the owner on paper, but I run this ranch. That's how it's going to stay. Grace felt her spine stiffen. Mr. Keller, I believe we need to have a conversation about your future here. Perhaps you should come to the house this afternoon, and we can discuss the terms of your continued employment. For a moment, she thought Dutch might explode. His fists clenched at his sides, and the muscles in his jaw worked furiously. Then he seemed to get himself under control. Fine. 3 o'clock. He turned on his heel and strode away, barking orders at the nearest ranch hand. Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking, and she clasped them together to hide the tremor. You handled that well, Silas said, his voice carrying a note of approval. Dutch doesn't like being challenged, especially not by a woman. Grace looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. He was older than her, probably close to 30, with the weathered look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with ropes and axes and the raw materials of wilderness survival. Muscles corded his forearms, visible where his sleeves were rolled up, and his chest was broad enough to make her feel small in comparison. Everything about him spoke of strength and self-reliance. I appreciate your intervention, she said, but I need to handle Dutch myself. I can't afford to look weak. Silas studied her for a long moment. You don't look weak to me, but Dutch is the type who won't accept a woman's authority, no matter how capable you prove yourself to be. Your father knew it too. That's why he asked me to keep an eye on things after he got sick. Grace's breath caught. My father asked you that, in his last letter. He knew he was dying, and he knew Dutch had been getting ideas above his station. Jack didn't trust him, but firing a foreman from 1,000 miles away would have left the ranch in chaos. Silas shifted his weight, looking almost uncomfortable. I told him I'd watch over things. Guess that includes watching over you now. Something in Grace's chest tightened at the thought of this strong, quiet man making a promise to her dying father. I don't need watching over, Mr. Everett. I can take care of myself. A hint of a smile touched Silas's lips. I'm sure you can, but there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely, and call me Silas. Mr. Everett was my father, and he's been dead near 20 years. Grace found herself returning the almost smile. Then you should call me Grace. Miss Zimmerman makes me feel ancient. Grace, Silas repeated, and the way he said her name, low and careful, made something flutter in her stomach. It suits you. Before she could respond, one of the ranch hands called out to Silas about supplies, and the moment broke. Silas tipped his hat to her. I'll be around if you need anything. Dutch is going to push back hard, and it might get ugly. Grace watched him walk away, noting the confident set of his shoulders, and the way the other men deferred to him despite his unofficial status. There was something about Silas Everett that commanded respect, something that had nothing to do with titles or authority, and everything to do with the kind of man he was. The afternoon meeting with Dutch went exactly as Grace had expected. He refused to show her the account books, claiming they were in town with the banker. He dismissed her concerns about the cattle drive and made it clear he had no intention of consulting her on any decisions. When Grace finally told him his services would no longer be needed after the month's end, he laughed in her face. "You think you can run this place without me? You'll be bankrupt in 6 months if you last that long. No man in this territory will work for a woman boss, and you'll find yourself alone and helpless before winter." Grace kept her voice steady despite the anger coursing through her. "I'll take my chances. You have 30 days to complete any ongoing work and train your replacement. I'm being generous because my father valued your service, but if you cause any problems, that timeline will shorten considerably." Dutch leaned forward, his face inches from hers. "You're making a mistake, little girl, a mistake you'll regret." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Keller?" "I'm stating facts. This is man's country and it will chew you up and spit you out." He stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "I'll stay the 30 days, but only because I have wages owed to me. Don't expect any help beyond that." After he left, Grace sank into her father's desk chair, her bravado crumbling. Dutch was right about one thing. She had no idea how to find a new foreman, and most men wouldn't work under a woman's direction. She was in a difficult position, and she knew it. A soft knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, hastily wiping her eyes. Silas entered, ducking slightly under the doorframe. In the confines of the house, he seemed even larger, his presence filling the small room. He carried a worn ledger under one arm. "Thought you might want to see the real account books," he said, setting the ledger on the desk. "Dutch keeps a separate set in town, all neat and tidy. But Jack showed me where he kept the actual records. They tell a different story." Grace opened the ledger with trembling fingers, her eyes widening as she scanned the entries. "He's been skimming money. Not large amounts, but consistently, for months. And selling cattle on the side, keeping the profits for himself," Silas added. "Jack suspected but couldn't prove it. I've been watching Dutch's operation, and I know he's got a buyer in Independence who doesn't ask questions about brands or bills of sale." "Why didn't you stop him?" Grace asked, then immediately regretted the accusatory tone. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that." Silas didn't take offense. "Because I had no authority to do anything, and if I'd confronted Dutch without proof, it would have been his word against mine. A foreman versus a mountain man with no official standing. But now you're here, and you have the authority." Grace looked up at him, seeing the intelligence behind those gray eyes. "You've been investigating him." "For 3 months, ever since Jack asked me to keep watch. I've got documentation of cattle sales that don't appear in the books, testimony from a few men in town who have done business with Dutch on the side, and evidence of falsified records." Silas pulled out a folded packet of papers from his shirt. "Enough to have him arrested if you want to go that route." Hope surged in Grace's chest, followed quickly by caution. "If I have him arrested, it will cause a scandal. The ranch's reputation will suffer, and I'll be painted as a vindictive woman who couldn't handle her foreman." Silas nodded slowly. "Probably true, but if you let him walk away, he'll spread poison about you all over the territory. Either way, you're facing an uphill battle." Grace studied the papers, her mind racing through possibilities. What if I confront him with the evidence and give him a choice? Leave immediately with no wages owed, or face arrest and prosecution. He walks away with nothing but his freedom, and I make it clear that any slander will result in legal action." "That might work," Silas said, "but you'll need someone to back you up when you confront him. Dutch is mean when he's cornered." "Will you be there?" Grace heard herself ask before she could second-guess the request. Silas's expression softened. "I'll be there. Your father asked me to watch over things, and that's what I intend to do." That evening, with Silas standing silently behind her chair, Grace confronted Dutch Keller with the evidence of his theft. The foreman's face went through a range of colors, from red to white to a mottled purple. He started to bluster, then to threaten, but the combination of hard proof and Silas's intimidating presence eventually broke through his defenses. "You have until dawn to be off this property," Grace said, her voice hard. "If you're still here when the sun comes up, I'll have the sheriff waiting. And if I hear that you've been spreading lies about me or this ranch, I'll make sure every lawman from here to San Francisco knows about your thieving ways." Dutch's eyes burned with hatred as he looked at Grace, then shifted to Silas. "You think you've won something here, mountain man? You think playing protector will get you into her bed and into this ranch?" Silas moved faster than Grace would have thought possible for a man his size. He had Dutch by the shirt front, lifted half off his feet. "Watch your mouth when you speak about her," Silas said, his voice deadly quiet. "And get off this property before I forget I'm trying to avoid violence." He released Dutch with a shove that sent the former foreman stumbling back. Dutch caught himself, straightened his shirt, and spat on the floor. "You deserve each other," he snarled, then stormed out of the house. Grace and Silas stood in silence for a long moment after the door slammed. Finally, Grace said, "Thank you. Again." Silas turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. "No thanks needed. Your place is on this ranch, running it the way your father wanted. Anyone who tries to take that from you will have to go through me first." The intensity of his statement left Grace momentarily speechless. She searched his face, trying to understand what she saw there. Loyalty, certainly. Respect. But beneath it all was something else, something that made her skin warm and her breath come faster. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." Silas was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his words. "I knew your father. He talked about you all the time, about how proud he was of your strength and your mind. When he asked me to watch over the ranch, I don't think he just meant the cattle and the land. I think he meant you too." He paused, his gray eyes holding hers. "And now that I've met you, I understand why. You're everything he said you were." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't used to such straightforward compliments, especially not from men who looked like they could wrestle bears and win. "I need to find a new foreman," she said, trying to redirect the conversation to safer ground. "Someone I can trust. Do you know anyone who might be willing to work for a woman?" Silas's mouth curved in something that might have been amusement. "I might know someone." "Who? Me?" Grace blinked in surprise. "You, but I thought you preferred the high country. The trap lines and independence." "I do. But winter's months away, and you need someone now, someone who knows the ranch and won't try to undermine you." Silas leaned against the doorframe, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I can manage the hands and handle the daily operations. I know cattle and horses, and I know this land. And more importantly, I'll actually listen to what you want and make it happen." Grace wanted to say yes immediately, but caution held her back. "What about when winter comes? You'll want to go back to your trap lines. Maybe. Or maybe we'll have found someone else by then. Or maybe I'll find that ranch work suits me better than I thought." Silas shrugged those massive shoulders. "Let's take it one season at a time." It made sense, and Grace knew she was unlikely to find anyone else who met her needs as well as Silas did. But there was something about working so closely with him that made her nervous in a way that had nothing to do with his qualifications. Something about the way he looked at her, the way her body responded to his nearness. "All right," she said finally. "On a trial basis. We'll see how it works out." Silas nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face that transformed his rough features into something almost handsome. "You won't regret it, Grace. I promise you that." The next weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Grace with its ease. Silas proved to be everything he'd promised as a foreman and more. He woke before dawn to organize the day's work, assigning tasks to the ranch hands with quiet authority that they respected. Unlike Dutch, who'd ruled through intimidation and exclusion, Silas consulted Grace on every major decision and made sure she understood the reasoning behind the daily operations. He taught her to read the subtle signs of illness in cattle, to judge the quality of hay and grain, to calculate profit margins and seasonal expenses. He never talked down to her or dismissed her questions, treating her instead as a partner in the ranch's management. The other hands, seeing Silas's respect for Grace, slowly began to follow his lead. But it was the small moments that Grace found herself treasuring most. The way Silas would appear at her elbow when she was struggling to lift something heavy, his strong hands taking the burden without comment. The quiet conversations they shared in the evening when the work was done, sitting on the porch and watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The way he listened when she talked about her father, her memories, her dreams for the ranch. One evening, about 3 weeks after Dutch's departure, Grace was going over the books in her father's study when Silas knocked on the open door. "Got a minute?" Grace looked up, noting the serious expression on his face. "Of course. What is it?" Silas entered and sat in the chair across from the desk, his large frame dwarfing the furniture. "We need to talk about the roundup. It's time to bring the cattle down from the high pastures and sort out what we're keeping and what we're selling. It's a big job, and we'll need extra hands." Grace set down her pen. "How many extra? 4 or 5 good men for about 2 weeks. I know some reliable hands who have worked roundups before, men I trust." Silas leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "But there's something you need to understand. Roundup is hard, dangerous work. Cattle get spooked, horses go lame, men get hurt. And having a woman present, even if she's the owner, is going to make some of the hands uncomfortable." Grace felt her defenses rising. "Are you saying I should stay in the house while you handle everything?" "No," Silas said firmly. "I'm saying you should know what you're getting into if you ride with us. Some of the men will resent you. Some will try to test you. And if something goes wrong, they'll blame it on having a woman along, whether it's your fault or not." "I can handle resentment," Grace said. "I've been handling it since I arrived." Silas studied her for a long moment, and Grace found herself unable to look away from those intense gray eyes. Finally, he nodded. "I believe you can, but I need to know you understand that I'm going to be protective. If someone disrespects you or tries to cause trouble, I'll deal with it. I can't promise to be diplomatic about it." Something in Grace's chest warmed at his words. "Why are you so protective of me, Silas? And please don't say it's because you promised my father." Silas was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. "Because from the moment I saw you standing up to Dutch, refusing to back down even though you were scared, I knew you were someone worth protecting, someone worth standing beside." He paused, then added, "And because I've come to care what happens to you, more than I probably should." Grace's heart hammered in her chest. She'd known, on some level, that something was growing between them. But hearing Silas put it into words made it real in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. "Silas, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Silas said, standing. "I'm not asking for anything from you, Grace. I just wanted you to know where I stand." where you'll always find me if you need me." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Think about the roundup. Let me know in the morning what you decide." After he left, Grace sat staring at the ledger without seeing the numbers. Silas's words echoed in her mind, and she found herself touching her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart. She'd been attracted to him from the beginning, drawn to his strength and quiet confidence. But attraction was one thing. What Silas was offering felt like something deeper, something more permanent. She thought about her father's dreams for the ranch, about her own determination to prove she could manage it alone. But who said being strong meant refusing help? Who said independence meant isolation? Silas wasn't trying to take over or control her. He was offering to stand beside her, to be a partner in more than just ranch management. The thought both excited and frightened her. She'd seen too many women lose themselves in marriage, their property and rights absorbed by their husbands. But Silas had never once tried to override her authority or make decisions without her input. He'd proven, day after day, that he respected her judgment and valued her opinions. Grace made her decision that night, though she didn't fully acknowledge it to herself. When morning came, she found Silas in the barn, checking the horses that would be used for the roundup. "I'm riding with you," she announced. "I need to see how a roundup works, and I need the hands to know I'm not afraid of the hard work." Silas looked at her, and something like pride shone in his eyes. "All right then, but you follow my lead when it comes to safety." "Agreed, agreed." The roundup began 3 days later with 7 additional men joining the regular ranch hands. Silas introduced them to Grace, making it clear that she was the owner and that her word was law. Some of the men looked skeptical, but they kept their opinions to themselves. The work was every bit as hard as Silas had warned. They rode out before dawn into the high country, where the cattle had scattered across miles of rough terrain. The days were long and exhausting, spent in the saddle searching for strays and driving them toward the main herd. Grace's muscles screamed in protest, and her skin burned despite the hat she wore to shield her face from the relentless sun. But she kept pace with the men, refusing to show weakness or ask for special treatment. She learned to read the cattle's behavior, to anticipate when they might bolt, to position her horse to block escape routes. She fell twice when her mount spooked, picking herself up and remounting without complaint. And slowly, grudgingly, she earned the respect of the additional hands. Silas was always nearby, watching without being obvious about it. Grace caught him looking at her more than once, his expression unreadable but his attention constant. He never interfered unless she was in genuine danger, trusting her to handle herself but ready to step in if needed. On the 4th night, as they camped in a high meadow with the cattle settled nearby, Grace sat by the fire nursing her bruised body and exhausted mind. Most of the hands had already rolled into their bedrolls, leaving just her and Silas awake under the vast canopy of stars. "You did good today," Silas said quietly. "Handling that bull when he broke from the herd, that was brave." Grace smiled tiredly. "Brave or foolish, I'm still not sure which." "Brave," Silas said firmly. "Foolish would have been running away. You stood your ground and turned him back." "That takes courage." Grace looked at him across the fire, noting the way the flames cast shadows across his strong features. "I had a good teacher, and I knew you were there if things went wrong." Silas's expression softened. "Always will be if you let me." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Grace found herself standing, moving around the fire until she was beside him. Silas looked up at her, and the vulnerability she saw in his eyes stole her breath. "Silas, I need to know something," she said softly. "What you said the other night about caring what happens to me, did you mean it?" "Every word," Silas said. He stood, towering over her but somehow not making her feel small. "Grace, I know this isn't the time or place, but I can't keep pretending that I see you only as the boss or as Jack's daughter. When I look at you, I see a woman who's strong and brave and stubborn as hell. I see someone who makes me want to be better, to do better. Someone who makes me think about building something permanent instead of drifting through seasons." Grace's breath caught. "I feel it too. This thing between us. I've been trying to ignore it to focus on the ranch and proving myself, but it's getting harder." Silas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with one large, calloused hand. His touch was gentle despite his strength. "Your place is beside me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not behind me, not following in my shadow, beside me as an equal. If you'll have me." Grace leaned into his touch, feeling tears prick her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you." Silas's other hand came up to frame her face, and then he was kissing her, soft at first and then deeper as Grace responded. His lips were warm and firm, tasting of coffee and campfire smoke, and Grace felt something in her chest unlock and expand. She wound her arms around his neck, pressing closer, and felt the solid wall of muscle that was his chest against her body. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably talk about this properly. Make plans." Grace laughed softly. "Probably, but not tonight. Tonight, just hold me." Silas gathered her into his arms, and they stood together under the stars, the sounds of cattle and night birds surrounding them. Grace had never felt so safe, so cherished, so completely where she belonged. The rest of the roundup passed in a blur of hard work and stolen moments. Silas was careful not to show favoritism in front of the hands, but at night, when the others were asleep, he and Grace would sit together and talk quietly about the future. They discussed the ranch, their dreams, the life they might build together. Silas was clear that he wanted to marry her, but insisted she take time to be certain. Marriage was serious, especially out here where divorce was scandalous and difficult. Grace knew her heart already, but she appreciated his caution. She'd been raised to think carefully about major decisions, and marriage to Silas would change everything about her life. Not just her personal life, but the way others perceived her and the ranch. A married woman had different legal standing than a widow or spinster, and she needed to understand the implications. When they returned to the ranch with the sorted cattle ready for market, Grace wrote to an attorney in San Francisco, asking about property rights for married women in California. The response came 2 weeks later and was more encouraging than she'd hoped. California law allowed married women to maintain separate property if proper legal documents were filed before the marriage. She could remain the sole owner of her father's ranch, with Silas having no legal claim unless she chose to add his name to the deed. She showed Silas the letter one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "This means I wouldn't have to give up the ranch to marry you. We can be partners without you automatically becoming the legal owner." Silas read the letter carefully, then set it aside. "Grace, I want you to understand something. I never wanted your ranch. If we marry, it's because I want you, not your property or your cattle or your land. You could be penniless, and I'd still want you beside me." Grace felt her eyes sting with tears. "I know that, but I needed to know that we could marry and I could still maintain my independence. Not because I don't trust you, but because I need to prove to myself that I can do this. Run the ranch, make it successful, be the woman my father believed I could be." Silas took her hand, his large fingers intertwining with hers. "Then we'll do it your way. You'll keep the ranch in your name and I'll be your foreman and your husband. We'll build something together, but it will always be your legacy from your father." "Our legacy," Grace corrected softly. For our children when we have them. Silas's eyes widened slightly. You've thought about children. Grace felt herself blush but met his gaze steadily. I've thought about everything. Our life together, the family we might have, growing old on this ranch watching the seasons change. I want all of it, Silas, with you. Silas pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness that made her melt. Then marry me, Grace Zimmerman. Make me the luckiest man in California. Yes, Grace said against his lips. Yes, I'll marry you. They were married 6 weeks later in Keeler's small church, with the ranch hands serving as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Grace wore a simple cream-colored dress that she'd commissioned from the town seamstress, and Silas wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. The ceremony was brief, the words traditional, but when Silas slipped a plain gold band onto Grace's finger and promised to stand beside her always, Grace felt the truth of it down to her bones. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables of food and a fiddle player the hands had chipped in to hire. Grace danced with Silas as the sun set, his strong arms steady around her, and felt like the world had shifted into its proper alignment. That night, in the room they now shared, Silas was gentle and patient as he introduced Grace to the physical aspects of marriage. He took his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and when they finally came together, Grace understood what it meant to be truly one with another person. Afterward, lying wrapped in his arms with her head on his chest, she listened to the steady beat of his heart and knew she'd found her home. The following months brought their own challenges and triumphs. Silas proved to be not just an excellent foreman but a true partner in every sense. He taught Grace the intricacies of cattle breeding and market timing, while she introduced more efficient record-keeping systems and negotiated better prices with buyers. Together, they slowly expanded the ranch's operations, adding quality breeding stock and improving the facilities. The territory's attitudes toward a woman rancher softened when people saw that Grace's ranch prospered under her management. The fact that she had a capable husband didn't hurt, but Silas made sure everyone knew that Grace made the final decisions. He deflected attempts by other ranchers to negotiate directly with him, always referring them to his wife. It earned him some mockery from men who believed women belonged in the home, but Silas bore it with quiet dignity. Winter came, bringing cold winds down from the Sierra Nevada and snow to the high country. Silas had thought he might miss the trap lines and the solitary life he'd known before, but he found he didn't. Waking up beside Grace, working alongside her, building something lasting together, these things satisfied him in ways his previous life never had. Grace discovered she was pregnant in early spring, about 8 months after their wedding. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She'd heard the stories about childbirth, about the dangers women faced, and she knew her mother had died giving birth to a stillborn baby when Grace was 10. Silas sensed her fear without her saying a word. "We'll get through this," he said, holding her close. "I'll take care of you and we'll find the best doctor in the territory. You're strong, Grace, stronger than you know." Grace clung to him, drawing strength from his certainty. "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll take care of our child. Promise me." Silas pulled back to look at her, his gray eyes fierce. "Nothing is going to happen to you. I won't allow it. You're going to have this baby, and then we're going to have a dozen more if you want them. We're going to grow old together on this ranch, watching our grandchildren run through these fields. That's the future we're building, Grace. Don't doubt it." His conviction steadied her as it always did. Grace nodded, blinking back tears. "All right, I believe you." The pregnancy progressed without major complications, though Grace found the summer heat exhausting in her condition. Silas was attentive to the point of being overprotective. insisting she rest frequently and refusing to let her do any heavy work. Grace chafed at the restrictions but understood they came from love. When her time came in late October, Silas sent for the doctor from Lone Pine, a town 20 miles north with better medical facilities than Keeler. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly a full day and night. Silas paced outside the bedroom, going half mad with worry at Grace's cries of pain. He prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, making desperate bargains if only Grace would be all right. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, he heard a baby's cry. Silas burst into the room, his eyes finding Grace immediately. She was pale and exhausted, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but she was alive and smiling weakly. "Come meet your son," she whispered. Silas approached the bed on shaking legs and looked down at the tiny, red-faced infant the doctor held. His son. His and Grace's son. The baby had a shock of dark hair and surprisingly strong lungs, his cries filling the room with indignant fury. "He's perfect," Silas breathed, carefully taking the baby when the doctor offered him. The infant settled slightly at his touch, and Silas felt his heart crack open with a love so fierce it was almost painful. Grace reached up to touch her husband's face, seeing tears track down his cheeks. "We did it. We made it through." Silas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, placing the baby in Grace's arms. "You did it. You're the strongest person I've ever known, Grace Everett." They named him Samuel Jack Everett after Silas's father and Grace's. Little Samuel was a healthy, vigorous baby who kept them both awake at night with his demands for food and attention. Silas proved surprisingly adept at infant care, changing diapers and walking the floor with Samuel when Grace needed rest. The ranch hands found it amusing to see their tough foreman cooing at a baby, but they respected him too much to say anything to his face. Life settled into a new rhythm as autumn turned to winter. Grace recovered her strength quickly, returning to the ranch's management with Samuel often strapped to her chest in a sling she'd made. Silas worried she was doing too much too soon, but Grace was determined to prove she could be both a mother and a rancher. "My place is beside you," she told Silas one evening as they sat before the fire, Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle. "Whether that's in the house or out in the fields, we're partners in everything, remember?" Silas pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I remember. You remind me every time I try to be too protective." Grace laughed softly. "Someone has to keep you in line, mountain man." "Your place is beside me," Silas murmured, echoing the words he'd spoken that first day when Dutch had tried to put Grace in what he thought was her place. "Always has been, always will be." The years that followed were full of both hardship and joy. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful operations in Inyo County. Grace earned a reputation as a shrewd negotiator and innovative rancher, while Silas was known for his integrity and skill with cattle. Together, they weathered droughts and harsh winters, market crashes and occasional conflicts with neighboring ranches. They had 3 more children over the next 8 years. A daughter named Sarah who had Grace's chestnut hair and Silas's gray eyes, another son called Thomas who was quiet and thoughtful, and finally another daughter, Elizabeth, who proved to be as stubborn and determined as her mother. Samuel grew into a strong, capable boy who loved the ranch and showed early signs of having his father's way with horses. He followed Silas everywhere, learning to rope and ride almost before he could walk properly. Grace watched them together and felt her heart swell with love for these 2 people who meant everything to her. Sarah was gentle and kind, with a gift for healing injured animals. She spent hours in the barn, tending to sick cattle or splinting a bird's broken wing. Grace saw in her daughter a compassion that would serve her well, whatever path she chose in life. Thomas preferred books to ranching, and while this initially concerned Silas, Grace encouraged their son's intellectual pursuits. The world was changing, she argued, and having an educated son would benefit the family in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Silas came around to her way of thinking, as he usually did. Elizabeth, the baby, was a whirlwind of energy and mischief from the moment she could crawl. She kept everyone on their toes and tested the limits of their patience regularly, but she also brought laughter and light into their home. As the children grew, Silas and Grace made sure to tell them about their grandfather Jack, about the ranch he'd built and the dreams he'd had for his family. They taught the children that a person's worth wasn't determined by their gender or station in life, but by their character and their willingness to work hard for what they believed in. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Silas took Grace riding up into the high country where they'd first kissed during the roundup. They left the children with trusted ranch hands and spent a rare day alone together, just the two of them and the mountains. They stopped in a meadow filled with wildflowers, the same meadow where they'd camped a decade earlier. Silas spread a blanket and they lay together under the open sky, watching clouds drift past. "You ever regret it?" Grace asked quietly. "Giving up your trap lines and the freedom you had before?" Silas turned his head to look at her, his gray eyes as steady and sure as they'd been the day they met. "Not for a single second. You gave me something better than freedom, Grace. You gave me purpose. You gave me a family and a home and a reason to build instead of just drift. You gave me everything that matters." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. "You gave me the courage to claim my place in the world, to stop apologizing for being strong or capable or ambitious. You stood beside me when everyone else tried to push me aside." Silas pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Your place is beside me, Grace Everett. It always has been from the moment I saw you. I think I knew it then, even if it took me a while to admit it." Grace kissed him, pouring 10 years of love and gratitude into the gesture. "Her place is beside me," she repeated softly. "That's what you told Dutch, wasn't it? That first day when he said I didn't know my place." "I did," Silas confirmed, "because I could see what he couldn't. That your place wasn't in some box someone else defined. Your place was wherever you chose to stand, doing whatever you chose to do, and I wanted that place to be beside me." They made love in the meadow, slow and tender, celebrating the life they'd built together. Afterward, as the sun began to set, they rode back to the ranch, to their children and their home and the legacy they were creating. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Samuel, at 18, proved to be a natural rancher with his father's strength and his mother's business acumen. He took on more responsibilities, learning to manage the hands and make decisions about breeding and sales. Grace and Silas knew that someday the ranch would pass to him, and they took pride in preparing him for that responsibility. Sarah, at 16, surprised everyone by declaring her intention to study medicine. It was an unusual path for a woman, but Grace encouraged her daughter's ambitions, using her own experience as proof that women could succeed in male-dominated fields. They arranged for Sarah to apprentice with a doctor in San Francisco, though it broke Grace's heart to send her daughter away. Thomas, at 14, showed interest in law and politics. He devoured newspapers and legal texts, discussing current events with anyone who would listen. Silas, who'd once been skeptical of book learning, now found himself fascinated by his son's insights into the changing world. Elizabeth, at 10, was still deciding who she wanted to be. She showed talent for art, covering every scrap of paper with sketches of the ranch, the mountains, her family. Grace saved every drawing, treasuring these glimpses into her youngest daughter's creative mind. As their children grew toward adulthood, Grace and Silas found themselves with more time together. They took long evening walks, discussing the day's events and making plans for the future. They talked about eventually stepping back from the daily management of the ranch, letting Samuel take the lead while they provided guidance from the background. "I want to travel," Grace said one evening as they sat on the porch. "I want to see San Francisco, maybe even go back to St. Louis and show you where I grew up. The ranch will be in good hands with Samuel." Silas smiled, pulling her close. "Then we'll travel. Anywhere you want to go, Grace. We've earned some adventures together." But before they could make specific plans, illness struck. Silas developed a persistent cough that winter, one that wouldn't respond to any treatment. Grace insisted he see the doctor from Lone Pine, who examined him gravely and pulled Grace aside afterward. "It's his lungs," the doctor said quietly. "All those years in the mountains breathing cold air and smoke, the damage is extensive. I'm sorry, Mrs. Everett, but there's not much I can do." Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "How long?" The doctor shook his head. "Impossible to say. Could be months, could be years. But he needs to take it easy, avoid exertion and cold air." Grace refused to accept the diagnosis. She consulted with doctors in San Francisco and Los Angeles, tried every remedy and treatment suggested. Silas bore it all with patient grace, knowing that Grace needed to fight this battle even if he'd already accepted the outcome. For 2 years, Silas declined slowly. He could no longer do heavy ranch work, and he tired easily. But his mind remained sharp, and he continued to advise Samuel and discuss management decisions with Grace. He sat on the porch in the mornings, watching the sun rise over the mountains he loved, content with the life he'd lived. Grace spent as much time as possible beside him, reading aloud when he was too tired to talk, simply holding his hand when words weren't needed. The children took turns sitting with their father, sharing memories and soaking up his wisdom while they still could. On a clear spring morning with wildflowers blooming in the meadows and the mountains standing stark against a blue sky, Silas called Grace to his side. He was in bed, too weak now to rise without help, but his eyes were clear as he looked at her. "Come here, love," he said softly. Grace sat beside him, taking his hand. It was thinner than it used to be, but still strong enough to squeeze hers gently. "I'm here, Silas. I'm always here." "I know you are," Silas said, smiling. "You've been beside me every step of the way, just like I promised you'd be all those years ago." He paused, catching his breath. "I need you to promise me something, Grace." "Anything," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "Don't stop living when I'm gone. Don't close yourself off or let grief consume you. You've got too much life left to live, too much left to do. The ranch needs you, the children need you. Promise me you'll keep going, keep building the legacy we started together." Grace wanted to argue, to tell him he wasn't going anywhere, but she knew better, so she nodded, squeezing his hand. "I promise." "But Silas, I don't know how to do this without you." "Yes, you do," Silas said firmly. "You knew how to run the ranch before I came along, and you'll know how to run it after I'm gone. I just had the privilege of standing beside you while you did it." He reached up with his free hand to touch her face. "I love you, Grace Everett. Loving you has been the greatest honor of my life." "I love you too," Grace whispered. "So much that I don't have words for it." Silas smiled, his eyes drifting closed. "Your place is beside me, Grace. Always. Even after I'm gone, part of me will always be beside you, in every sunset, every mountain peak, every strong wind that blows down from the high country. You'll never truly be alone." Those were the last words he spoke. Silas Everett died that evening, surrounded by his wife and children, peacefully slipping away as the sun set over the ranch he'd helped build. He was 52 years old, and he'd lived every one of those years to the fullest. The funeral was attended by nearly everyone in Inyo County. Ranchers and townspeople, men who'd worked alongside Silas and women who'd respected his partnership with Grace, all came to pay their respects. They told stories about Silas's integrity, his strength, his quiet wisdom. They spoke of how he'd stood beside his wife when others would have tried to control or diminish her, how he'd redefined what it meant to be a man in a territory that prized traditional masculinity above all else. Grace stood through it all with dry eyes, drawing on reserves of strength she'd built over years of meeting challenges head-on. She accepted condolences gracefully, thanked people for coming, and held herself together until everyone had left. Only then, alone in the house she'd shared with Silas, did she finally break down and weep. Samuel found her in the bedroom she'd shared with his father, holding one of Silas's old shirts and sobbing into the fabric that still smelled faintly of him. He sat beside her silently, offering his presence as comfort, so much like his father in that moment that Grace's heart ached anew. "He made me promise to keep going," Grace said when she could speak again. "To keep living, keep building. But Sam, I don't know if I can." Samuel put his arm around his mother, this strong woman who'd faced down hostile foremen and skeptical neighbors, who'd built a successful ranch through sheer determination and intelligence. "You can, Mama, because that's who you are. Papa knew it, and so do I. We'll get through this together." And they did. Grace threw herself into the ranch's operation with renewed focus, channeling her grief into productive work. She taught Samuel everything Silas had taught her, preparing him to eventually take over completely. She wrote letters to Sarah in San Francisco, encouraging her daughter's medical studies. She helped Thomas prepare for university, where he would study law. She nurtured Elizabeth's artistic talents, making sure her youngest daughter knew she could be anything she chose to be. 2 years after Silas's death, Samuel married a local girl named Mary Henderson. She was a practical, kind young woman who understood ranch life and wasn't intimidated by her formidable mother-in-law. Grace welcomed her warmly, seeing in Mary the same determination that had driven her own success. When Mary gave birth to a son a year later, they named him Silas Jack Everett, honoring both his grandfather and great-grandfather. Grace held her grandson for the first time and felt Silas's presence so strongly it was almost tangible. She looked into the baby's gray eyes, so like his grandfather's, and knew that the legacy she and Silas had built would continue. Sarah completed her medical training and returned to California, opening a practice in Independence that served the scattered ranches and mining towns of Inyo County. She was one of the first female doctors in the region, facing prejudice and skepticism just as her mother had. But Grace's example had taught her to persist, and Sarah eventually built a successful practice. Thomas graduated with honors and became a lawyer in San Francisco, where he specialized in property law and women's rights. He helped draft legislation that expanded married women's property rights in California, inspired by his mother's experiences and his father's respect for her independence. Elizabeth traveled to Europe to study art, sending home letters full of descriptions of museums and galleries. She eventually returned to California and became a well-known painter, capturing the stark beauty of the Sierra Nevada in works that were exhibited throughout the western states. Grace lived to see all 4 of her children established in their chosen paths. She lived to hold 12 grandchildren and even 3 great-grandchildren. She ran the ranch for another 20 years after Silas's death, finally stepping back at 70 to let Samuel take full control. Even then, she remained active, advising on major decisions and walking the property she'd fought so hard to keep. On a spring morning much like the one when Silas had died, Grace woke early and walked out to the meadow where they'd first kissed during the roundup. She was 78 years old, her hair more silver than chestnut now, her body worn by decades of hard work and mountain weather. But her mind was still sharp, and her memories were vivid. She sat on a rock overlooking the valley, watching the sun rise over the mountains. In the distance, she could see the ranch buildings, smoke rising from chimneys where her grandchildren were probably starting breakfast. She could see cattle grazing in the pastures, the result of careful breeding programs she and Silas had started so long ago. "I kept my promise," she said aloud, speaking to Silas as if he could hear her. "I kept going, kept building. Our children are happy and successful. The ranch is thriving. We did good work together, Silas. Damn good work." She felt a warmth spread through her chest, and for a moment she could almost feel Silas's arms around her, his voice in her ear saying what he'd said so many times. "Your place is beside me, Grace. Always." "I'm ready now," Grace whispered. "Ready to be beside you again. Not behind you, not following in your shadow. Beside you, as an equal." Grace Zimmerman Everett died peacefully that morning, sitting in the meadow where she'd fallen in love with a mountain man who'd seen her for who she truly was. Her family found her hours later, a peaceful smile on her face, looking out over the land she'd fought to keep, and the legacy she'd built. Her funeral was even larger than Silas's had been, with people traveling from across California to pay their respects. They spoke of her courage and determination, of how she defied expectations and proved that women could succeed in any field they chose. They talked about the partnership she'd shared with Silas, a marriage of equals that had been ahead of its time. But more than anything, they spoke of love. The deep, abiding love between Grace and Silas that had sustained them through decades of challenges and triumphs. A love built on mutual respect and shared dreams, on standing beside each other rather than one above or behind the other. Samuel buried his mother next to his father on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with matching headstones that bore simple inscriptions. Silas's read, "He stood beside her always." Grace's read, "She stood beside him always." The ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's management, and eventually passed to young Silas Jack, Grace's eldest grandson. He ran it with the same combination of intelligence and integrity his grandmother and grandfather had modeled, teaching his own children that strength came in many forms, and that the truest partnerships were those built on equality and respect. On quiet evenings, when the wind blew down from the Sierra Nevada, and the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, the family members would sometimes swear they could see two figures walking together in the high meadows. A tall, broad-shouldered man with long dark hair and a strong-willed woman with chestnut curls, their hands clasped, their steps matched. The ghosts of Grace and Silas Everett still beside each other, still walking the land they'd loved together. Because some loves are too strong to be contained by a single lifetime, some partnerships too powerful to end with death. Grace and Silas had found their places beside each other in life, and they remained there in death, watching over the legacy they'd built and the family they'd raised. A testament to what could be accomplished when two people stood together as equals, facing whatever challenges came with courage, determination, and unwavering love. The ranch still stands today, passed down through 6 generations of Everetts. The current owners, direct descendants of Grace and Silas, maintain it as a working cattle operation while also preserving the historical buildings and telling the story of their remarkable ancestors. Visitors come from all over to hear about the woman who defied convention to run a ranch in 1879, and the mountain man who loved her enough to stand beside her rather than try to stand in front of her. It's a love story that resonates across time, reminding people that true partnership requires respect, that strength comes in many forms, and that the most powerful words anyone can hear are these: "Your place is beside me, always."